The moderator of this session, Jack Davis, is a nationally recognized professional who's earned the respect of business leaders, senior elected officials, and public servants. Since 2008, Mr. Davis has been the chairman of CEO Mobile, Inc., and has specialized in providing advice on strategy and leadership to CEOs and corporations. He has a long history of leadership in healthcare and the public sector, having served as the president and CEO of the Calgary Health Region for over 8 years and as a deputy minister in the province of Alberta for 5 separate ministries over a 10-year span. Mr. Davis currently serves on a number of boards, including the boards of directors of Terranet, CBI Health Group, and Life Labs, Inc., and as a director of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships and a member of the Board of Governors of the Banff Centre. Please join me in welcoming Jack Davis.
Thank you. One of the great things about having your own company when you eventually get retired out of the public service is you get to write your own intros and bios. So that one's probably a little over the top. I might tone it down. Well, welcome everybody. We think we've got a really interesting panel this afternoon. It's the part 2 of the fundamentals session, and it's dealing with barriers, real or imagined, to P3 processes with a focus primarily on the municipal level. Got a great panel, and I'm going to introduce them now. Starting over on my right, Michael Buda, Director of Policy and Research for the FCN, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Richard Aboud, the founder and president of Forum Equity Partners, Inc. Doug Ewing, the Vice President Projects for Partnerships, BC. Louise Penton, next to me, Managing Director, P1 Consulting, Inc., and she says all of these attractive women in the front row work in her organization as well, so that's a very dynamic group. And Matt Ney, the financial advisor, Kinbasket Sewer and Water Company, Shuswap, Indian Band. So what we're going to do today is deal with what we think some of the barriers, some of the opportunities, needs and qualities of P3s that really work at the municipal level. So that's going to be our focus. We've got 6 topic areas we're going to deal with, and what we're going to do, I'll just go through the topic areas very briefly, then various members of our panel are going to dig in and lead and have a bit of an exchange on the issues, and we'll follow all of that. That'll go on for about 45, 50 minutes. We'll follow that with a little bit of a question period. So we're going to talk a bit about context. What are the overall needs for infrastructure at the municipal level, and why would P3s be appropriate? We're going to spend some time on procurement, and we all know there's lots of issues around procurement, whether it's P3s or non-P3 type procurement. A popular issue always, funding and financing. We're going to talk about technical expertise required to, and advisors required to really make sure the process stays on track. What type of monitoring processes need to be in place again to make sure we've got good compliance and things are on track. And then we want to talk about some of the more innovative elements that a P3 process could bring to municipalities, and in particular, what new areas that might be ripe for P3 processes that haven't quite been tapped yet, such as real estate, social housing, those types of things. So that's kind of where we're, our roadmap for the day, and we're going to start with the context, and I think we're going to ask Michael to kick it off with a discussion on sort of needs at the municipal level.
Sure, thanks, Jack. So maybe I'll pick up a little bit from the mayor's panel this morning, and perhaps just drop down a bit so that when we're here to talk about municipalities and P3s, we're starting with a common understanding of some of the challenges that municipal infrastructure is facing and municipal government as well, because it's both those pieces are really what we need to talk about when we try to understand P3s. So first of all, I think it's important to remember one of the reasons why municipalities, I know many of you who are looking, who are in the financing and project management game when it comes to P3s are looking at municipalities, because of course municipalities own well over half of the public infrastructure in Canada, including a lot of that infrastructure which is in need of new investments. So why is that? I'm going to go through a few of the main pressures on infrastructure and then a few of the main pressures and challenges facing municipalities that together certainly have given rise to the so-called infrastructure deficit, but really I think for those who are looking to facilitate and develop new P3s, there are opportunities to apply this type of project management and financing scheme to these challenges. So from the infrastructure pressure side, municipalities obviously are facing a 20-year, almost a generation of underinvestment in their infrastructure, and especially in maintenance and in keeping up with demand. So there's a big lag in demand, a big backlog in maintenance. So there's a demand driver there. The other big demand driver, which I think is sometimes difficult, it's easy to forget, is obviously our population is growing, and more importantly, as a country, we're urbanizing. So we're seeing infrastructure built, especially in our larger metropolitan areas, built for populations that are much smaller than they are today. So especially in those larger areas, we're seeing demands on infrastructure we didn't really face a decade or two ago, so when it comes to thinking about P3s, obviously projects that are in fast-growing urban areas, you're going to see more opportunities. And the last one, probably a little less of a large effect, but still I think significant, is going to be growing, is pressures from climate change. So the need to adapt our existing infrastructure to new weather patterns and the rest. So those are pressures in infrastructure. Municipal governments themselves are facing pressures which are important to think about when we're thinking about the context. The first is that the types of infrastructure services and the quality of infrastructure that municipalities need to provide are being constantly changed by regulation. So provincial and federal governments pass new regulation which require municipalities to change or improve the types of infrastructure they're providing. So an example right now, the federal government has got a set of proposed wastewater regulations that will require secondary or tertiary treatment at all, or almost all wastewater treatment facilities in all communities across the country. A huge need, $20–30 billion worth of new wastewater infrastructure, of course, much of which is certainly probably at least applicable for consideration for P3s. Another big challenge I think municipalities have faced in the past, but it's certainly declining, is an aversion to debt. Through the 80s, of course, many municipalities got burned by high interest rates, and in the 90s, of course, public debt became a bad word with the fight against the deficit and the federal debt. And that trickled down to municipalities. Elected municipal leaders didn't feel like there was a lot of support for debt, so it meant that there was an underinvestment in infrastructure and capital projects, and also a real challenge in facing capital projects because no matter how you financing them, debt's involved. So that was a real challenge at a government level. And the final one, it's more of an opportunity, but it's certainly a challenge, is this notion of global competitiveness, culture, or knowledge workers, the whole Richard Florida thing. But certainly for larger communities, it's important. But then on the flip side, we've seen the challenges facing the country when we underinvest in infrastructure in areas like Fort McMurray, which has held back the development of the oil sands. So those are some of the challenges facing municipalities. I just want to spend a couple minutes on some of the new developments that are coming down the pipe that are really important certainly for the members that we represent at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, but I think are really important for everyone who's thinking about P3s to be aware of. And I think the most important one I want to just spend a bit of time on, and I know it was mentioned briefly this morning, is the federal government's commitment in the budget last year to develop a long-term infrastructure plan. What this plan is going to really do, it's going to allow all the players in the infrastructure sector, so provincial and territorial governments, the federal government, municipal governments, and industry, to get together and actually develop a long-term plan which includes objectives and targets and milestones as well as funding, and over a longer period of term, not the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 year cycles that we've seen in the past, but 10 or 15 or more years, and actually pull together this plan. So we're working with the federal government and provinces and industry, and it's going to spend the next 2 or 3 years doing this, so that by the time 2014 rolls around, which is when most existing federal infrastructure programs expire, and indeed the same applies in many provinces, we've got an investment plan in place to take us to the next decade or more. So there's both an opportunity there, because I think it'll be a real opportunity for the country to talk about the importance of infrastructure, and then a more targeted opportunity to think about how P3s are going to fit into that. I think the other opportunity from the infrastructure plan is that, especially when we think about P3s, and this is sort of shifting to the last part of my comments, how P3s fit in and how municipalities are thinking about P3s. Obviously, and a few of the mayors talked about it this morning, the public doesn't like talking about project financing. They like to talk about projects. They don't like to talk about debt. They don't like to talk about more taxes or user fees. They don't like talking about privatization or P3s. It's a real challenge at the municipal level sometimes for municipalities to take on all the political risk and expend a lot of political capital to apply P3s as a project model. This infrastructure plan, I think, is going to allow all levels of government and industry to talk in a more rational way about how P3s are a workable solution, and both help educate the public about how it is a viable option, and then also share some of the political risk. When political risk is shared, it's easier to get political buy-in. And so I think that's really important. The last thing I want to leave is I was asked, well, why aren't municipalities considering P3s more? What do they worry about P3s? And I think I just remind you that just as I know the mayors talked about this morning, there's many ways to finance a project, but at the end of the day, if you can't service whatever whether it's a lease payment or a debt payment, if you don't have the funding in place, the funding available, the project's not viable. And so certainly for municipalities, this long-term infrastructure plan is going to give them the certainty they need and the predictability they need in funding to really project where they need to go and figure out what the gap is between where they want to be and what they have in terms of resources. So I think that'd be it for me for setting that context.
Thank you, Michael. And Matt, you were just going to touch briefly on...
Yes, I would like to be able to take the opportunity to put the First Nations component in context. The First Nation projects are probably in some respects a new sector. So we take it in full circle, but putting it into context is we're seeing the same sort of situation that Michael's talking about is municipalities have a huge infrastructure issue. First Nations, I think when people probably are aware of that through the releases in the press, that there's a similar situation or maybe even a more severe situation on First Nations land. We're working with the regional district in the Invermere area, just on the other side of Banff and the BC side. And in those areas, one of the challenges and barriers that we're seeing, and primarily, is the multi-jurisdictional issues. First Nations is a federal jurisdiction, and we're working with local government, and we're trying to get the province involved. And even as an example, the health sector is run by Environment Canada and Health Canada, and then the provincial side is run by Interior Health, a provincial organization. So working those things through. The expertise is a very common issue. I'm hearing from everyone on the panel is small municipalities, even larger ones I would understand, but certainly First Nations and regional district governments do not have the expertise to implement P3 projects. And we're finding quite often too is there's a misconception generally on the First Nations component and not really understanding what First Nations are doing. Some of the things we're finding too as well is when we start implementing infrastructure, that is water and sewer, or rationalizing services within a region, put it into more of a municipal type context, is we're finding environmental issues coming up is that there's anti-development components, and they partner up the idea that if we put in water and sewer, development will come, and so there's a perception that that's not of benefit. But why we're doing these things in general is we're working with regional governments to create a more regional context on how we do services and addressing both the water and sewer and general planning issues that are associated with all levels of government. So I think it's really unique in this situation to look at First Nations and saying, look, they can be part of the solution in a regional context. I'll give you a number of examples. We're working very closely with the Ministry of Transportation in creating highway corridors, and that ties in with our water and sewer planning for the region. And we've actually worked out joint agreements between Interior Health and Health Canada to monitor water distribution and sewage treatment in a context that's more of a regional context, so there's a cooperative level there. And by the way, that was a lot of effort to bring the province and the feds together. We're addressing issues of housing. So in a development context, social housing is a major area because this is a high-end development region for the Calgary context where people want to retire. but it also delivers a high level of service sector which needs affordable housing. So we're working in the housing market to apply that as well. With First Nations involved in these sort of regional context planning components, we're seeing a lot of cooperation in funding, which assists all the levels of government in bringing the expertise together to make a P3 work, and then bringing in the expertise. So I think in the context of First Nations is we really have the opportunity to do a broader range of planning, bringing jurisdictions together, find a lot of sources, and get over those common barriers, particularly in a semi-rural or slightly urban context. And there's tons of examples throughout Canada where I think First Nations become a critical component within the P3 planning process. There's a lot of interest from the federal government, and I think from the province as well, to see First Nations involved in this. And so I would urge small municipalities or municipalities with First Nations adjacent that those type of dialogues be very productive. So.
Thanks, Matt. Well, I guess there's really no reason why municipalities can't cooperate amongst themselves, irrespective of whether they're adjacent to a First Nations group. But I think that's one of the interesting things. In order to get critical mass and size, sometimes you do have to have a number of jurisdictions coming together on a cooperative basis. So that's going to challenge, I think, everybody as we go forward. We're going to spend a little time on procurement now. Richard's going to lead it off, and we're going to have a look at it from two perspectives. One, what makes a procurement process work for bidders, and how do we ensure that public interest is protected throughout the process as well? So Richard's going to lead it off, and Doug and Louise are going to jump in the discussion.
Great, thanks. So I guess before we get into what we as bidders might look for from municipal procurement, maybe to get a sense for the room, how many people here represent a municipality, work at a staff level within a municipality? Okay, wow.
I think we've got more on your side.
All right, there you go. How many developers in the room?
Oh, not that many.
Not that many. Provincial or federal representatives? Okay, service providers. There we go. Okay, thanks very much. That helps a lot.
How many people are on the wrong panel?
We got some inflow recently. Something must have happened over there, Doug. Okay, so briefly, what do we look for? I think the other developers in the room would largely agree that we look for a reliable procurement, one that is most likely going to lead to a conclusion. Things that frighten us are 11 to 10 council votes on whether to go ahead with this. Councillors who conduct themselves in certain ways that suggest the vote is part of a broader strategy. Tremendous uncertainty at the council level brings tremendous concern. As everyone knows, bidders invest significant dollars pursuing projects, and stability is key. If municipalities were to find their way to either bring much more true commitment to the process through either committing in advance to a project that gets through certain hurdles, they would clearly need to do this in camera, and clearly would need to get comfortable with the idea that there would be no further debate if the project could be delivered within those timeframes. That would certainly provide us with the required comfort. Another solution would be to provide significant break fees that would render the project more attractive if there is a tight council vote, one that brings a lot of uncertainty into the mix. Clearly, we look for a smooth and efficient process, one that's run by people who've done this in the past. Of course, we all recognize that even for the largest municipalities, it may be uneconomic to resource the kind of skills that are required to procure complex projects of this kind in an efficient and orderly manner. So there's clearly a tremendous opportunity to partner with the provincial procurement agencies that have done tremendous work in building up their skills and resources to resource these things and procure these things effectively. We've seen lots of examples recently with the OLRT project, Kananaskis in Alberta, and some examples coming up in BC where the municipalities have hooked up with the provincial procurement agencies. We certainly look very favorably upon that for all the good reasons one would imagine. Professional advisors on the government side are very helpful. We often see municipalities, unfortunately, make the mistake of hiring the local favorites who are learning on the job and costing their client as well as the bidders significant time, effort, and money in the process. We look for opportunity to create a bit of a value-added proposition. One of the benefits of smaller projects is that they don't necessarily have to fit within a rigid box, and oftentimes in municipality you can add some value through economic development opportunities. Often in a social infrastructure project, the building itself is perhaps an anchor to a broader development, or could be an anchor to a broader development, and we look very favorably to those opportunities to add some value and sort of broaden the opportunity to cover, in fact, in our case, even real estate development as part of the overall picture.
Thanks, Richard. Doug, you want to jump in? Partnerships BC,
Sure.
probably the the agency that kicked it all off in Canada.
Well, it's good to hear, Richard, that we're certainly got the same lens on things. And PBC right now is working with a lot of different clients that are kind of outside of the province for broadening our base in terms of the types of projects that we're working on and also the clientele. And when we first sit down and start with them, and start working with them, the key message we say, what's most important is not only does the public side need confidence in the process, they need confidence that they're going to get value for money, they need confidence that it's going to be run well, but also the market does too. And if you get both sides having confidence in it, you'll get a much better procurement, you'll get a much more competitive price, and I think you get a much better result. So that really is kind of the foundational message that we give them, is that it really needs to work on both sides. It can't be a process that's set up specifically and solely for the public sector, because it doesn't work if the market or the private side doesn't have the same confidence that you do. We look at a couple different aspects when we talk to them about it. First, it's got to be transparent and fair. That's the hallmarks of certainly I think the P3s across the country. They have a very good sense of transparency. They're fair. They do deliver good value for the taxpayer, and they've got a really consistent approach. And we kind of dig down and start talking what that means is when you think about the transparency, the fairness, and I'll leave it to Louise to talk about the fairness a little bit, but on the transparency and consistency side, the market really needs to know what the scope is. They need to know how they're going to get paid, and fundamentally in the procurement is they need to know how to win. They don't want to enter into a procurement process that's ambiguous. They don't want to enter into something where there isn't a clarity on the goal. There isn't a clarity of how all three proponents on the shortlisted team can win. And so that's where we actually spend a lot of time, is starting to think about what the objectives of the procurement are, what are you trying to do, and how can you best articulate that through your RFP and more specifically through your submission requirements and evaluation criteria, so that everybody knows how to win, and at the end of the day, that the solution and what's being brought forward best suits your needs. So lots of talk about that in the procurement side. And then, as Rich has started to talk about discussions around the type of documentation, consistency of process, break fees are important. We're a big proponent of that, because when we deal with municipalities and that, we say, you really want to put your money up because you want to show the market that you're prepared to move ahead with this project. And that just, again, further reinforces the need for confidence in the market. So some of the other stuff when we talking about documents and that, we can get along, talk about a little bit later on in the panel.
Okay, thank you. Louise, you were going to talk a little bit about fairness.
Yeah, so one of the business lines of P1 Consulting is to act as fairness advisors. We've done about 50 projects over the last couple of years, and one thing that I can tell you from all of the perspectives of the clients we've worked in is the intentions are always good. So we don't deal with clients who want to do things that are incorrect. So as the fairness advisor on projects, what we're looking for is really to ensure that there's a consistent application of the process, that bidders are treated in an equitable manner, that information is shared amongst the bidders in a manner that is really conducive to getting the best result. Often we'll also measure outcome and process risk and support the clients we work with on finding a good way to achieve their objectives. So, you shouldn't think of the fairness advisor or monitor as the bad guy on the team or the one who's just there to watch and make sure to catch you in a mistake. And the process really is a lot more proactive, so that at the end of the procurement, everyone can stand very proud and say, essentially we've got the best solution and we've done it in a fair manner. So, it really is quite simple.
reassuring that you're not out to just catch people. We're going to spend a little time on funding and financing now, and Doug and Michael are going to lead us initially through a few thoughts on that. I'm sure other panel members will jump in as well.
Sure, so you want me to kick off?
Yep.
So this kind of is the big question that's always asked. You know, our clients always ask us, why should we pay more? You know, what's it worth? And I think we all should, you know, have the 30-second elevator pitch to kind of seed those comments, because we get it all the time. We get it from new clients and old. And really, what is the value that the private sector bring? Why should we pay a little bit more in order to get the value? And, you know, so our elevator pitch is that there's a couple things that you need. Yes, it costs more, so we do look to optimize it. You know, our deals rarely see 100%. In fact, they don't see 100% financing anymore from the private sector. It's a combination of public and private. And we also look for the type of deals that there is. There is no one model fits all for these projects. They're unique, they're complex, they're different asset bases, particularly as we start to look at different projects now that don't fit into our typical kind of hospital or transportation model. So, you know, you need to look at the risks, and you need to make sure that it's complicated and complex enough that the private sector can bring efficiency to that and can take those risks on at a less cost than you can. It needs to be efficient, so they need to be able to bring some efficiencies to it. And it actually, I think, along with those, is it needs to leave room for innovation. Like, it's fundamental. And so that's our elevator pitch when we talk to new clients. It says, yes, it's going to cost you more. The private sector is going to bring some good due diligence. They're going to be able to take on those risks at what we believe is less cost than you can. We think they're going to bring some inefficiency. And if the project doesn't allow for innovation, then we really need to think about it. We need to think about either it needs to allow for innovation, so we need to open up the performance specs and look at what the private sector can bring, or we need to really think whether it's a P3. And you know, if it's a simple project, it probably doesn't necessarily need to be one. And a lot of the projects that we look at BC never actually become P3s for those reasons that I just said, that there isn't sufficient enough room from the private side to offset the cost of financing.
And Michael, you're going to kind of spend a little bit of time on some of the challenges from the municipal side, both funding and financing. And I wouldn't be surprised Richard wants to jump in here as well.
Sure. Actually, if you
Go
don't mind,
ahead,
maybe
yeah.
I'll jump in on Doug's comments here. I think what's interesting about the financing piece is it's the easiest one to benchmark, right? So the Muni did their last bond at 100 over. Simple dimple to benchmark that thing. But they haven't built a water treatment facility in a little while, tougher to benchmark. They haven't built an art center recently, much tougher to benchmark. So, you know, clearly they're focused on, as you pointed out, one element of the overall cost picture, and value for money is where we really need people to focus, and that's what our industry is born on and succeeds upon. It is an uncomfortable and unfortunate benchmark that they do focus on so much, but I think with good partners at the provincial procurement level, we can certainly overcome these obstacles and work to get this part of the industry rolling.
Sure. I think the only thing only few things I'd say are, you know, one, and I think you just alluded to it. You know, not every project is going to be appropriate for a P3. I know that's why at FCM we spend a lot of time working with the federal government to ensure that they understand that really the best place to make that kind of decision is at the project level between the project proponent, so the municipality, and the developer. And that possibly, and actually hopefully with the assistance of a provincial procurement agency like PPP, Partnerships BC, or Infrastructure Ontario, or the others, people with expertise. The reason we're cautious about federal or even provincial conditionality around that is that, as you say, the tools are so specific and the project needs are so unique that you really need to put them all in the mix and make the decision locally. And I think the second, as I mentioned earlier, one of the basic challenges or barriers facing greater use of P3s in Canada is that municipalities have fairly limited funding tools. They rely mostly on the property tax, although the good news is user fees are making up a larger and larger percentage of municipal owned source revenues, which is a good thing, A, because it's another revenue source, but B, user fees indicate that there's a service with a very clear beneficiary, which makes it that much easier to think about how to cost them and how to pay for them later on down the road. So the take home for me when I think about this is, these aren't obviously silver bullets. We need to look carefully at a project by project rather than a sector by sector approach, and really needs to be a decision made at a project level, and that it's limited funding available for the public sector. No matter how that funding is generated, that often limits looking at P3s. If you don't have money to, as I said, if you don't have money to finance your debt or your lease payment through a P3, it doesn't really matter whether a P3 is perfect for that. But that there's the increasing incidence of the use of user fees, I think, is a really positive example, as well as some other innovative taxation approaches like tax increment financing. Again, they're going to create an environment that P3s are going to be able to flourish within.
Thank you. We spend a bit of time on what we call technical expertise and advisors, but to me it really fits more in the category of what I call setup and execution risk. There's a lot of good ideas out there that are well-intentioned, but unless things are properly set up at the front end, and unless they're properly managed and monitored through the execution phase, they tend to kind of go astray. And it's interesting, I did spend a lot of years in the public service, and I can say I was involved in a few things that went astray. And generally speaking, in the public sector, when things go astray and you're doing them yourselves, there's a certain amount of criticism, but it's not jumped upon with the same focus as it is in a P3 or a process involving external partners, where there just seems to be a much higher level of scrutiny. So there's good and bad news in this. I think the bad news is higher level of scrutiny. The good news is higher level of scrutiny means you're probably going to do it better. And that's kind of been the history of P3s in Canada, as you saw from Jane's opening comments. Why is it done better? Well, I think it's done better because, as we see at this conference, there's a huge body of expertise developing in this country in a variety of areas that are relevant to P3s. And what we're going to spend a little bit of time on here is what kind of technical expertise do we need in order to ensure that we've got good setup and good implementation. And on this one, I think Michael's going to start things off. Matt's going to jump in, and Doug, and I would suspect the whole panel, because I think everybody's got something to offer in this really critical area.
Sure. Well, I mean, all I can say is what I hear from our members. We represent all large and medium-sized municipalities, as well as most rural and smaller municipalities across Canada, is that, frankly, for the vast majority of them, so that's right up to probably municipalities in the 75 to 100,000 population range, they simply don't have any in-house capacity to reasonably consider the right kind of P3 project. Or if they do, they may just think that they do. And so I think it goes to, I think it was your point that sometimes people are learning on or maybe it was Richard, is yours, of learning on the job, which probably isn't the best way, especially if you're entering into something for the first time, to set something up for success. We're certainly hearing that a large majority simply don't have the right expertise, or more importantly, even the access to the right expertise. So again, it's the local favorite who doesn't have really any experience doing this, which is why I know we're very supportive, and our members are very supportive of provincial procurement agencies like Partnerships BC and others to help provide direct support and help build the capacity of municipalities. And certainly we feel the same about P3 Canada as well, that it's not just a fund to enable and facilitate P3 projects, but it's a venue, and indeed the council and this conference and others are ways to help build the literacy around these issues, build the capacity, the networks that are really key. So I mean, right now I would say the majority of our members outside of the largest cities really don't have the in-house capacity, nor do they even have great access to service providers that they know and have worked with. I mean, it's one thing to get someone from another community, a bigger city, a long way away. It's another thing to actually know them and have a relationship and be able to trust them.
Yeah, I think Richard made a good comment too, is some municipalities have the expertise to do certain projects, but they don't have an expertise to do an art center. I think the point from the First Nations perspective and smaller community perspective is there's probably not a lot of expertise for any level of project that's being required for some of these water and sewer and road projects and what have you. And there's pressure on all municipalities and First Nations for sure to implement some of these more sophisticated projects. So, and from experience, basically, because we've been working with P3 Canada, and we're sort of at the cusp, the tipping area where we say, yeah, we can manage this, to where now we know we can't manage it, and we need the expertise to work on it. So I would certainly encourage that we're hiring from the get-go the proper expertise to implement these projects. And again, recognizing that there's a relativity in the size of projects and the size of the communities and their related sophistication is we don't have it. So we
Which
need
I
those
guess kind of gets back to your earlier point about bundling, trying to get more intermunicipal cooperation.
Yes.
Bundling projects, getting critical mass and size that you can afford to deploy that level of expertise.
No, and absolutely, and I think certainly P3 Canada and other organizations are looking favorably with First Nations and local governments working together to support that type of expertise to get those things going. So it's
Speaking of P3 Canada, I think Greg Melchin, the chair of the board of P3 Canada, is in the audience. It was a minute ago. There he is. So anybody that wants to chat with Greg afterwards, we have him identified. You're welcome. Just before we turn it over to Doug, I think one of the interesting things about the agencies such as Partnerships BC and Infrastructure Ontario, I was at a presentation a while ago that David Livingston from IO made, and it's actually quite remarkable to look at the number of projects that have been successfully completed under the so-called P3 model. And I think a lot of that is due to much better front-end planning, setup, and better management of the execution risk, partly because of agencies such as Partnership BC and IO. And the more I think that government ministries, municipalities, and others are kind of working with that expertise, we're just going to get more done. And that's one of the big issues with infrastructure. I can recall from my government days, we always had a big infrastructure budget. It used to go up and down, but generally there was money there. It was trying to get it spent because processes weren't as crisp and as disciplined as they've become. So,
Absolutely, Jack, and that's actually the point that I wanted to talk about is the actual implementation and execution risk and getting it done. So, our experience has been in municipalities different because their level of sophistication differs. But what we often see is they want to jump into a project without actually thinking about the project. And it's one of the, I think, P3 Canada has brought a lot of good things to the municipal market across the country. One of the great things, apart from money, that I think they brought is a discipline. And so, at the provincial level, we have a lot more influence because we do concept plans, we do business cases, we describe the project, and we actually figure out the investment decision before you get into the procurement. And that goes a long ways to, one, knowing what you want, giving the market a lot of confidence that it's going to get there because the politicians have all signed up to it. The municipal level, that varies. And again, back to P3 Canada's processes, is that they demand and need a concept plan being done. It's part of their screening process. And then a very detailed business case. And we are working on several business cases in different municipalities in BC, in the Lower Mainland specifically. And it's a different process to them, but they actually can stand up in front of their council with a detailed investment decision about this is what it's going to cost, this is what we want, and I tell you, it's unique. So I think that, to your part, is when you get through that, then actually the procurement goes much smoother because you've actually figured out how you're going to pay for it, regardless of whether P3 Canada money is going to come in or not. The second thing that, Matt, you brought up was around governance and how you work with the different regional levels and also just internally within, whether it's at a band or municipality. And one of the kind of the hallmarks I think that PBC has worked with at the provincial level is to make sure that there's a project board set up for each project. So the different levels of the government, our clients, ourselves sit on that, and it's a much more streamlined process, and I think it's much more effective in terms of making sure that when you do get into procurement, decisions can be made very timely, and in order to satisfy the rigor and the fast track pace of procurement. So that's certainly on the municipalities. We hope to see that type of model adopted. We hope to see them actually adopting a project board type structure where they consolidate that approval process. I mean, it'd be good to see as these complicated, complex projects where, no matter as you're talking about, when you got these different regional and First Nations interests, that they can come together and making decisions at one level. think that would be, instrumental to success in these projects.
If I could just add because we've talked a lot about the transaction and the procurement, and really when you think about it, the project actually just starts after the deal is done. So yes, you definitely need advisors to help you with the procurement, with the legal part of it, the business case, but it's also important to think about the advisors for the operational phase. That often is an afterthought, so if I had one piece of advice, think about it in advance, because that's what you're going to be left with at the end of it. There's really 25 years of operations and 2 or 3 years of construction and et cetera. So it's very important to think about, once the deal is struck, how is it going to work? And when we talk about monitoring, we can talk about some of the tools that are really important, but advisors to help you figure that out are also important.
Jack, I can jump in if I may
Yep,
on this
sure.
one. It seems clear that the advice from the panel is head for your provincial procurement group and do it with certainty. I'll sort of caution against one potential line of thinking that we see sometimes within municipalities when we talk about expertise. Many are quite proficient at procuring capital projects and do this quite regularly and quite proficiently, and have a very competent legal group, have a very competent procurement group, and have a very competent treasury group. But it really is worth noting that it's the integration of these disciplines in one project to ensure that they're properly managed and done so in a rounded manner that is reflected in a completely separate discipline, which is the business of procuring public-private partnerships. It would be dangerous and erroneous, in my opinion, to view having those independent expertise that may be very competent individually as sufficient to undertake a P3 procurement.
Richard, you have got the makings of a book there that would be a bestseller, because it doesn't really matter what it is. That's the art of management, is being able to integrate. And I absolutely agree with you that sometimes expertise in silos doesn't mean you're going to have a good product unless you can bring the pieces together. We can talk a little bit about monitoring. I just thought I'd set a bit of a context on this, having been in government, as I say, and actually years and years ago, having been a Deputy Minister of Municipal Affairs and having worked with municipalities. One of the underlying fears that I think municipal governments have, and to some extent even provincial ministries, but certainly municipal governments, if they engage in a process like this, they're going to lose control. And one of the things about being in government when you're elected to a council, you want to be in control, you want to exercise control. You don't want to turn it over to a business entity or a consortium. You want to feel that you're still steering the ship. I think what we've heard today is that in order to make sure the ship is well steered, you have to get lots of help and expertise. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Louise, because this is your core business, to tell us how a municipal government ensures that things are under control, they're living up to their responsibilities while still playing in this larger, complicated team that hopefully is well integrated, but nevertheless a larger, complicated team.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd say that in any of the P3s or AFP projects, the government entity does not lose control. They change the control. So in effect, what you control is the what, the requirements, the outcomes. Those are the things that get managed by the teams, the stayback teams that oversee these arrangements. How, the frequencies, the methods that are used, that's left to the partner. And that's where the innovation comes into play. That's really the value that the P3 partners can bring to the table. Their approaches, their methodologies, et cetera. So if you consider that the control rests in what you're looking for and the outcome, and that you leave your partner actually control how they're going to manage it, then you need to have something that's going to bridge it. So the elements that bridge these types of arrangements are a good solid agreement. Clear, very clear, concise requirements that are set out and well understood by both parties. Very, very important that that's understood during the procurement and afterwards. The second is really to have good measurements. So key performance indicators and availability type measurements that in fact get you what you want. So be clear, and also the element that's important is to have a good solid team to oversee these. They don't manage themselves. A partnership has two sides to it, and you really do need to have a well-trained in-house team to make sure that you get what you want. It's important to note these projects aren't perfection, they're partnerships. Things are going to occur, and you need to have processes actually to deal with that. So if you look at what makes the project works, well, first of all, I'd say start with a very good, solid, well set up relationship. This starts at the commissioning, at the beginning of the project and during the commissioning phase of the project. Have close monitoring to ensure that the project actually delivers what it's supposed to. More issues occur because things have not been done properly during the commissioning phase of the project. Make sure there are checks and balances every step of the way, not only from a construction perspective, but from an operator perspective, that in fact the functional requirements are being met. Train people. It's a different approach. You can't assume that people who've been doing projects a certain way all of a sudden are going to know intuitively how to manage these types of projects. You need to train the service providers, the users, the stayback team, so that they all work very well together. Make sure that you have a dedicated and experienced team to oversee these arrangements. I mean, the outsourcing sector is a good indicator. They've done this now for many years, and it works. Have pre-established, agreed-upon tools that in fact drive the performance that you're looking for. I always say be careful what you ask for, because you're going to get it. And so be clear about what expectations and objectives you're looking for, and have good escalation processes. Often I deal with relationships that have a couple of bumps in the road. 9 times out of 10, it's because they haven't escalated things properly. People sit on problems, they complain about them, but they don't actually get resolved. So, set up the project properly, make sure you have good governance, make sure you have the right skill sets, and then you get out of the gate properly. Second fundamental thing is have the right people. It is a very different type of approach. So if you have someone who's typically dealing with construction type projects or just operational, you might have issues down the road. So you need to help them make that organizational shift, and make sure that you have the right committees set up. I think someone mentioned it a little earlier on. Very important to have that so that things are moving forward. Have the right tools. As I said earlier on, good solid agreement, well understood, not full of legal jargon, although we need some, but really clear so that the operators can understand what they actually have to do. And train people on the agreement. I would say that, again, 9 times out of 10, when I get involved in an arrangement, I ask the folks, have you read the agreement? And the answer is always no, we don't understand it. So it's the responsibility, of the project leads to make sure that the people are trained and understand how to navigate around those agreements. Most of them are well drafted. They're actually quite simple when you understand where to look for things. So very important to do that. Have good, reporting mechanisms as you go along. So you can see that there's a number of checks and balances as you develop these. The projects work when you have tools in place, when you have the right people in place, when you set them up properly. The performance indicators as well. Don't measure things just for the sake of measuring things. Make sure that they're telling you something so that you can actually act on them. Our preference is always advance warnings. So, are there things that you can actually measure that are going to indicate that something could happen? And the last 2 things from the tools perspective are audits. Really go in and do those audits. It's helpful for everybody. Again, it shouldn't be punitive or accusatory, but rather seen as a tool for continuous improvement. Satisfaction surveys are very helpful in ensuring that there's good control from the client perspective or the municipality's perspective. And continuous improvement. I mean, that's the 4th pillar of this. Train, train, train. I was just talking with someone outside of the room, and they said they're starting to have problems in their projects, 1.5 years out, and they're thinking, maybe we should train them again. Yes, make sure you keep people up to speed and you refresh. People do forget. Give an opportunity for people to interact on a personal level. Essentially the personal relationship on an operational contract is very, very important. Good communications is key as well. And regularly, I call it recalibrate your agreement. Objectives change over time. Priorities change. So sitting together with your partner and making sure that you're still aligned from both of your perspectives is really, really important to make it work. And have clear change management perspectives, because The only thing we know in a 25-year contract is actually things are going to change. So have a clear process. Again, very often I get involved and that hasn't been worked out and there are things changing, so figure out the tools. So people, tools, processes, and getting it right. Those are the things that make it work. When it doesn't, these agreements have very clear tools that you can use as well. So again, back to the control. The municipality, the client has control through the financial deductions that are ingrained in these types of agreements. The service, quality, and availability failures that find their way into there. The failure points that get accumulated and lead to different types of processes like monitoring and warning notices being sent. I mean, I like to tell a story that I have a very fast car and I love to drive fast, and if I only had to pay tickets for speeding, well, I just continue to speed and figure, that's just part of it. But with the failure points, just like on your license, when you get your demerit points, you accumulate those and you wind up driving the type of performance. So I don't speed because I don't want to get demerit points, and failure points drive the same type of performance from the partners. So look at each one of these and how they can work for you. And then dispute resolution if it has to go to that. So, you know, ingrained in these agreements are good, solid processes that provide you the tools to control, and where you don't get the control that you need, they're actually tools to rectify that through, you know, the progressive disciplinary action, as I call it, the financial deductions and failure points, et cetera. We've seen these work very well in the outsourcing sector. You know, the CBC's had a contract with a service provider for 15 years, managing very much under a similar type of context, and it's worked very well. So the same principles apply here.
Thank you. I think we're all interested to know what kind of car you drive.
Corvette.
Corvette, wow, very good. Matt, did you have a comment or two on that from your experience? Not on the Corvette, on...
I was just
It's
picturing Louise
convertible.
in the Corvette. Yeah.
Convertible.
We're not at that level yet. No.
I can weigh in on
Yep.
Louise's comments. I just want to amplify the people side. There's a line that's a favorite of mine that says, if it wasn't for people, we'd all be great managers. And I think there's a great truism there.
That's another chapter in the book.
Yeah, put it in there. You know, these things aren't built by spreadsheets; they're built by people, and you know, fortunately or unfortunately, people come with their own experience, and I think many people here have tremendous partnering experience and depth of partnering experience within their organization. So it won't be something most people in the audience won't understand, that learning to be a good partner is very different than managing a supplier relationship or managing a one-way or two-way black and white relationship. Partnership management is a skill that is really quite critical in these projects, and I think, as you said, Louise, resourcing the team with the right people that have those skills is absolutely critical.
Well, we're on our last topic. We're sort of on time. Just for a few minutes, even though I know when you look at this panel, you're not going to believe it, we're going to go wild and crazy. So
Live on the edge of it.
we are. We're going to just throw it open to anybody in the group.
Now I'm worried.
I don't know who's the wildest and the crazy. Just talk about some maybe novel applications for P3 process to the municipal level. Like, we always tend to think of, you know, roads, bridges, buildings, but is there something out there that's new and different that would really be very amenable to a P3 type process?
I would throw out a couple of ideas. I think I mentioned earlier that you know, we've seen and we've experienced and executed projects where a piece of social infrastructure serves as an anchor for a broader real estate development, perhaps taking some challenge land in a challenge area where the municipality can achieve a couple of objectives. One is to get that important piece of social infrastructure built, and the other would be to anchor that key piece of development. Often it makes sense to integrate these two kinds of procurements because they can work extremely well together. I would caution against municipalities, you know, not transferring their view from a, you know, structured finance project where everything is on time and on budget, and understanding that real estate development is much more dynamic and requires much more leniency and fluidity in how it is procured and managed, and really does require quite a dynamic partnering relationship to allow that to work in a practical way. But if done so, I think, using social infrastructure to deal with broader real estate development is a pretty effective opportunity.
There's one that Louise threw out a few days ago when we were having our prep meeting that I'd never thought of. I don't know if you remember what it was, but it was the example of street lighting, which is not wild and crazy, but it just, when I heard about it, that makes a lot of sense.
Actually, the City of Ottawa did a street lighting project a number of years ago, and essentially there's a lot of, again, benefit to embedding the life cycle, maintenance, and the overall operations of street lighting into a package.
And presumably now, we talked about environmental issues, replacing some of these older systems with new ones which are much more cost-effective and better environmentally.
Oh, definitely.
There probably is a business case for that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's also talk right now in the market about P3s in existing buildings and how to do exactly the same type of thing. Can you optimize an existing building and leverage that? I mean, so there's a lot of different things that we could look at as it relates to public-private partnerships.
And the business case there would be better utilization of space, better energy consumption, et cetera,
And it could involve a number of other different things. I mean, the CBC has a project right now they're looking at. There's development, so existing land that could be developed, as Richard mentioned. There's redevelopment of an existing site, optimizing it so they'd free up some space. So again, you have a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that can come together to make for an interesting project. It doesn't have to be a new facility on a greenfield piece of land. It could be a number of different things. The most important thing is there has to be a good business case. What we always say, again, from an operational perspective is essentially a bad business case doesn't make for a good project. And it's really important to start off with, as you were saying, good business case, solid team, and a great project.
Yeah, another interesting one that I'd heard of was whether it's things like transit stations or even arts facilities, bringing a whole commercial retail, mix into those types of things, which I guess is really what you were saying on developing the land. Brings revenue into the project that wouldn't be there. Generally, people, like the amenities are there, so it makes the whole thing a little bit more attractive as well. So those are interesting things if you can put them together, because it does require this, getting this diverse group of interests to cooperate and to agree. One thing that we didn't talk about, we just have a couple, maybe we should throw it open for questions. We'll just touch on this briefly. It really wasn't something we wanted to talk about, which was building support for P3s at the municipal level around some of the traditional opponents, which tend to be labor or even management sometimes in the municipal group, concern of change, what does it mean? And I guess we, in a way, have dealt with that by, if you have very good transparency, very good business case, very good process, no reason why it isn't possible to win that transparency, public relations battle. But we have 10 minutes left, so why don't we throw it open for questions to the group? We have one in the back. We have a mic here if anybody wants to come up and speak to it, or just speak loud and we'll try to.
Okay, I'll try speaking loud.
Yeah.
So, Doug, I was curious about your elevator speech, and you stated, and I know you've got 30 seconds on the elevator, so I'm just going to ask if you can expand on one statement a bit more. I'm curious about your statement that you acknowledge right up front, yes, it costs more. And I guess I'm wondering, are you acknowledging that in the same way that soup from Harry Rosen, you're going to pay more for a soup from Harry Rosen than you are from a soup from Moore's? Or are you actually factoring in, life cycle maintenance, operations, and where you're thinking that really, in fact, overall it doesn't cost more? Or are you really saying, well, yeah, you're going to pay more?
And well, thank you for bringing that up, because I didn't mean to say that it's going to cost more overall. It actually is specifically, and Richard kind of took off on that point, is to say that around the debt, You know, when you can so easily benchmark it off of what public debt can cost, it will cost more. That piece of it. But when you look at the value for money, so when you factor in all the things that I was talking about, risks both in the short term and long term, so you know, construction-based risks and long-term operating risks, when you look at the innovation that they can bring, so when you factor all those things in, which we call value for money, it costs less. So when you look at it from a holistic point of view, we're quite confident it costs less on specific projects. But when you talk specifically on the cost of financing, then it can cost more.
And that is one thing the P3 process does do for the public sector. It does get you to look at the overall life cycle cost of a project. A lot of projects were approved and got underway based on the cost to build whatever it was, without really looking at the long-term life cycle cost, maintenance, upkeep, operation, and that type of thing. So getting to look at that is you know, really critical.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? One here.
This is more for either Doug or Michael. What the city of Abbotsford on the program here, do their water treatment plant, and then having all the electric turning it down, even with the Beach for Canada funding, how does that impact, you know, lessons learned going forward as to how to deal with this project?
So I knew this question would come up.
So you have an answer then?
I'm just not sure how to answer that question well. It's just recently, it was Saturday, that it was defeated. It was a water treatment plant for Abbotsford. And so we haven't actually had a chance to talk to our clients around it. The couple things with that, though, in terms of how does it impact us going forward, I don't think it does. You know, we recognize that these projects are large and complex, and there's lots of different stakeholders, and there's opposition, and there's advocates for it, and there's advocates against it. So, you know, it underscores the need for communications and the need to get the message out about what you're actually building and why it's needed. Coming back right to the very beginning premise of when these projects need to be put together is to do that initial planning work, understand what your drivers are, and understand what you're really getting at, and then that's the message that you need to get out.
And it wouldn't necessarily interpret it, I'm sure it is to some extent a negative vote on a P3 process, but we don't put very much municipal or provincial infrastructure on the ballot for referenda. And it's hard to say what would happen to even non-P3 projects if they were on the ballot. You know, and that's just been traditional in Canada. I think those of us that do work or spend time in the United States know there's a lot of stuff there that goes on as referenda, and there's been some very interesting results because people tend to, you know, kind of vote against things rather than for them. So I used to work in the corrections industry years ago, and I still watch it, and it's fascinating for me to watch in the United States how periodically there's court-ordered direction to the states to deal with overcrowding in jails. They put prison construction on referendum, gets voted down. What do they have to do? Have to release a whole bunch of inmates in order to comply with the direction of the courts. So I think this is a big issue if we start to move a lot of these types of decisions onto referendum, both for P3s but for non-P3 type projects, and it'd be interesting. And again, you know, as we move into a new world, you know, of hyper-communication, who can win that communication battle, and don't assume that something makes sense just because it makes sense to you. You have to be out there interacting, and you know, we're seeing a breed of politics and politicians now, Twitter-based, you know, rapid communication. I think it's whoever masters that kind of, you know, is in the position of being able to influence things.
I might weigh in on this one, Jack.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to see something like this happen. As I understand, there was not two questions. It would have been preferable if there was one question about support for the project and another question about delivery method, P3 or traditional. I think, you know, we're interpreting this in our industry perhaps as a vote against P3, but maybe it's just a vote against the project. And, you know, hopefully clarity will come over time. But
Yeah, vote against spending money.
yeah.
Vote against losing control.
Well, I should add that in BC, well, first of all, in BC, these types of projects often have to go to referendum under legislation. But wastewater treatment in BC has gotten a little politicized. You know, do we really need to treat this waste at this level? So it could actually be a vote on whether or not this whole
Yep.
treatment issue is something like, I think you look at a city like Ottawa that, I don't know if you would, the LRT that the contract that the city had signed 3 or 4 years ago that fell through following a municipal election. The city, the council, and I think citizens, live in Ottawa, have really moved through that, and we're right back to the drawing board with obviously the routing and all the rest. But I wouldn't say that in Ottawa, there's been a pullback from the idea of a P3, even though in the end the break fee was $70 million, I think. So people in that city aren't really questioning the financing as much as the project. The project is really, I think, and this goes to Louisa's point, you have to make the business case for the project first and foremost. After that, I find that citizens start to tune out a little bit. With the exception, I think, around water supply. That's an area where people feel like if there's not complete public control, they get a little bit edgier. So I think that's where the communication becomes a lot more important.
Well, thank you. Our time's almost up. I'd like to thank our sponsor.
Question over there.
Oh, sorry, one more question. The last word.
About 15 years ago, I was involved in looking at some of the barriers that municipalities were facing when it came to outsourcing. For me, P3s are, it falls in the same category. And two of the main barriers were, one, taxation. That was GST, PST impact. You don't get tax on your own employees if you're self-employed. You do if you're outsourcing or you're putting P3. And the other one was labor issues, successor rates, unions. Do you see these still as being barriers for municipalities going?
So those are two very good questions. One is the impact of HST, PST, GST on using outsourced labor and third-party labor. I think that's a very good question. The other one was on successor rights if you're moving into an existing project with existing staff. Don't think we're going to have time to answer those here today, but we might take that one offline. Those are two very, very good questions. So thank you. I want to thank the panelists and our sponsor, Eric Burles. Thank you very much. We've got a really interesting, good discussion. And, again, the one thing, I've been coming to these conferences for a number of years, and as I sit with different panels and hear the presentations, the body of expertise that's being developed around P3s in Canada is quite remarkable. And our track record of successful planning and execution of these projects is amazing as well. So I think as long as we continue to move in those directions, we're going to see lots of projects that are done via this route, and they're done well. And we got issues to deal with, but we're getting things done. And, that's good. As Canadians, we never really had a track record for being able to get a lot done, and we've probably delivered more public infrastructure in the last 10 years than per capita than any other jurisdiction in the world. So thank you.